She was just 7 years old, her tiny hands red and cracked from the cold, her baby brother tied to her back with a worn scarf. As the rain fell over Philadelphia, she whispered the words that froze a millionaire CEO in his tracks. "I just want milk for my brother." In that moment, his world of wealth and silence collided with her world of hunger and survival. What he chose to do next would change both of their lives forever. This is not just a story about money, but about humanity. About the fragile thread that connects a child's plea to a man's forgotten heart. Stay with us, because what unfolds is a journey of compassion, courage, and the kind of love that builds families out of brokenness. The rain had only just begun that morning, a fine mist that clung to the streets of Philadelphia and painted everything in soft streaks of gray. Commuters hurried under umbrellas, car tires hissed against wet pavement, and the city's pulse beat with its usual indifference. Jonathan Miles stood beneath the awning of a small cafe, staring into a cup of espresso that had already gone lukewarm. He had woken up in the silence of his penthouse, taken the same private elevator, and followed the same routine he had perfected over years of habit. At 46, he had everything that most people dream of, yet the life he lived was marked more by emptiness than fulfillment. His empire was vast, built from towers of glass and steel, but his own soul felt like a hollowed-out room echoing with silence. As he adjusted his coat and prepared to step into the drizzle, he noticed nothing unusual at first. The streets were simply gray and forgettable, like every other morning. Then, a small figure near his car drew his attention. A girl, maybe 7, stood on tiptoe, wiping the windshield of his luxury SUV with a rag so worn it looked more like shredded cloth. Her thin wool coat was soaked through, clinging to her fragile frame, and her jeans were frayed at the edges. Jonathan slowed, unsure if his eyes deceived him, until he realized she was not alone. On her back, strapped tightly with a faded scarf, was a baby no older than a year. The child's head rested on her shoulder, sleeping soundly despite the damp chill in the air. Jonathan froze. His grip on the coffee cup tightened until the lid popped off, spilling onto the pavement, but he hardly noticed. In an instant, he was not in Philadelphia anymore. He was 10 years old again, standing behind his uncle's bar, wiping car windshields for loose change. He remembered the bitter cold, the sting of hunger, and the way a boy learns too soon that survival does not wait for kindness. That memory lived somewhere deep in his bones, and now, staring at this girl, it woke up with a sharpness he could not ignore. He stepped closer, crouching slightly to meet her eyes. She avoided looking at him, focusing instead on clearing the last streak of glass, her small hands red and cracked, knuckles raw from the cold. One scrape was open, faintly bleeding. His chest tightened. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than he intended. "Who told you to do this?" She paused, dropped her hand to her side, and whispered, "No one. I just wanted to clean it so I could get milk." Her gaze flicked to the bundle on her back. "For my brother. He hasn't eaten today." The words hit him harder than any boardroom debate or investor's criticism ever had. He looked again at the infant, his lips parted in shallow sleep, cheeks flushed from the chill. The girl adjusted the scarf to make him more comfortable, her movements practiced and protective. Jonathan felt a heaviness spread through him, something unfamiliar yet undeniable. He asked her name. "Callie," she said quietly. "And him?" "Noah." For a moment, the drizzle, the noise of traffic, even the cold seemed to fade. It was just the three of them, standing in a fragile silence that felt more real than the life Jonathan had been living for decades. Without thinking, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small paper bag he carried from the cafe. Inside was an almond croissant he had not touched. He offered it to her. She hesitated, uncertain whether to trust him, then took it with a carefulness that suggested she expected it to vanish from her hands. He also handed her the carton of oat milk he had bought for himself. Her eyes widened, and she clutched it tightly, as if it were treasure. "Thank you," she murmured. Jonathan said nothing more, but something deep inside him shifted. He could no longer pretend that this morning was ordinary. The mist turned heavier as they stood there. Jonathan's phone buzzed in his pocket, no doubt his assistant reminding him of the morning's board call. He ignored it. Instead, he asked where she lived. She pointed toward the edge of the neighborhood, where the buildings grew older and the shine faded from the windows. Franklin Terrace. He recognized the name. It was one of the few low-income complexes left in the area, a relic of poverty surrounded by the wealth he himself had helped create. He asked about her parents. "Mama passed," she said simply. "And my stepdad. He gets mad if I come home with nothing." She didn't cry when she said it. Her voice was matter-of-fact, the voice of someone who had grown used to carrying burdens far too heavy for her age. Jonathan did not know what moved him, only that he could not walk away. He crouched lower, brushing the wet sidewalk with his expensive coat, and asked gently if she would like a ride home. She studied him, weighing his words, before finally nodding. He opened the passenger door, helped her climb in, and watched as she adjusted Noah in her lap, tucking the croissant into her coat and hugging the milk carton like gold. Jonathan stood in the rain for a moment, staring at them through the window. Something inside him cracked wider. The emptiness he had lived with for years was suddenly filled with the weight of responsibility, a weight that somehow felt lighter than the loneliness he carried. He slid into the driver's seat, turning the heat toward her side of the car. Callie sat quietly, her coat dripping onto the floor mat, her small hands wrapped around the carton. Noah stirred in his sleep, letting out a faint sigh, and Jonathan tightened his grip on the wheel. The skyscrapers of Center City blurred in the mist as he pulled into traffic, each block feeling heavier than the last. He glanced at her, at the way she kept one hand on Noah even in sleep, at the way she glanced at him cautiously, not for approval, but for signs of danger. She had the instincts of survival, instincts no child should have to carry. He thought of his own past, of vending machines and long nights in cold alleys, of hunger that gnawed through pride. And he thought of the empire he had built, the empty luxury that filled his life but never satisfied him. Now, in the seat beside him, sat a child who reminded him of the boy he used to be, and an infant who had no choice but to depend on her. Jonathan realized, perhaps for the first time in years, that life had given him a moment that mattered. It was not wealth, or power, or prestige. It was this fragile chance to decide whether he would turn away or whether he would finally step into something real. As the car moved steadily through the rain-slick streets, Jonathan knew one thing with certainty. He could not look away. The drive to Franklin Terrace was short in distance, but long in silence. The city's polished facades gave way to streets marked by rusted staircases, cracked sidewalks, and forgotten storefronts. Jonathan's car stood out, like a foreigner among the sagging buildings. Callie sat stiffly, her coat pulled tight, clutching Noah as if the warmth of her small body was the only shield he had. Jonathan tried to think of something to say, but every phrase felt wrong, too shallow against the weight of what she carried in silence. When they arrived, the building rose before them like a warning. The bricks were discolored, the windows cracked, and the entrance littered with trash bags and a broken shopping cart. Franklin Terrace had once been meant as affordable housing, but years of neglect had turned it into something closer to a forgotten corner of the city. Jonathan parked and got out, holding the door open for her. She stepped onto the uneven pavement without a word, her small shoes damp, her eyes fixed on the doorway, as though she knew exactly what waited inside. The stairwell smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke. Each step creaked under their weight, and a rat darted behind a rusted pipe. On the third floor, they stopped in front of a dented door, with a number barely clinging to its surface. Callie pushed it open without knocking. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of alcohol and sweat. A television blared in the corner, flashing game shows across a room cluttered with bottles and stained carpet. A man slouched on the couch, unshaven, eyes glazed. Troy. He looked up when he saw Jonathan, suspicion clouding his expression. "Who the hell are you?" His voice was thick with drink, his words slurred. Jonathan spoke calmly. "A friend. I gave them a ride home." Troy narrowed his eyes, pushing himself upright. "Friend? Huh? You don't look like anyone we know. You a cop?" Jonathan shook his head. "No." I was concerned. It is cold, and the baby Troy cut him off, waving a beer can like a weapon. "Don't tell me how to raise them. They're fine." Callie slipped to the corner, unwrapping the sling and setting Noah into a drawer lined with an old towel. Jonathan's chest tightened at the sight. No mattress, no pillow, just a drawer on the floor. It was a crib, only in the most desperate definition. Jonathan tried to keep his voice even. "I'd like to help. Food, groceries, maybe supplies." Troy smirked. "Help? Unless you are here to buy something or someone. You can get the hell out." The words struck Jonathan like a slap. He froze, his jaw tightening. Troy stood unsteadily, leaning closer. "You want to help? $2,000 cash. That should cover what they've eaten since their mama died." His grin was jagged, his teeth yellow. "Fair price, right?" Jonathan's voice grew colder. "Children are not for sale." Something shifted in Troy's eyes. He reached for Callie, grabbing her arm roughly. Her body went rigid, her eyes wide but silent, as if she had learned long ago that screaming made no difference. That small flinch was enough. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice low and firm. "Let her go." Troy sneered, but eventually released her, scoffing. "Take them then. See how long you last." Jonathan did not argue. His gaze lingered on Callie, who now stood by Noah's makeshift crib, her hand resting protectively on her brother. She said nothing, but the silence spoke louder than any plea. Jonathan left the apartment with a storm brewing inside him. He had built skyscrapers, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and faced men twice as ruthless as Troy, but nothing had shaken him like the quiet terror in a little girl's eyes. The following day, Jonathan found himself in a department store aisle lined with baby supplies and toys, a place he had not stepped into in decades. He stood frozen in front of a wall of stuffed animals, unsure of what to choose. His hand hovered over a pink bunny before pulling away. Too clean, too perfect. Then he saw a gray rabbit with stitched patches, something that looked as though it had already endured hard days and survived. That one felt right. He added it to his cart, along with diapers, wipes, jars of baby food, medicine, and on impulse, a coloring book with crayons. As the cashier rang up the items, she gave him a curious glance, but he was too lost in thought to notice. When he returned to Franklin Terrace, Callie was sitting on the steps outside Noah, across her lap wrapped in a thin towel. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold. She did not smile when she saw him, but her eyes softened just slightly, like she had expected him to come back. He handed her the bag. She peeked inside and froze at the sight of the rabbit, her fingers brushing its ear with reverence before tucking it back quickly, as though she did not want to appear too eager. He cleared his throat. "I thought you could use some things, groceries, diapers, just to help." She nodded and led him upstairs. The apartment was no different from before. The same clutter, the same odor, the same neglect. Troy was nowhere in sight. Likely passed out in some other corner. Jonathan set down the bags and began unpacking. He held up a jar of baby food awkwardly. "I wasn't sure what he likes." Callie's voice was soft but certain. "Carrots," Jonathan smiled faintly. "Then I guessed right." She crouched beside him, picking up the box of crayons. "I used to draw," she whispered. "Mama kept everything I made, even the bad ones." Her voice carried no bitterness, just quiet memory. "What happened to them?" Jonathan asked. Her answer was flat. "Troy threw them out." Jonathan clenched his jaw, but kept his tone steady. "Maybe you can make new ones." She said nothing, but she did not let go of the crayons. That evening, back in his penthouse, Jonathan could not focus on the emails stacking in his inbox. Instead, he drafted a message to Lena Myers, a law school friend turned family attorney. His words were short, urgent. 2 kids, no bed, no food. They need help. "Not mine, but I cannot walk away," Lena replied quickly, her voice steady over the phone. "If you are serious, you need more than sympathy. You need proof. Are you ready for that?" Jonathan closed his eyes, recalling the image of Callie flinching at Troy's touch. He answered without hesitation, yes. From that moment, the path was set. Jonathan was no longer the man who woke each morning in silence and predictability. He had stepped into something raw, something uncertain, but something profoundly human. And as the rain swept across Philadelphia once more, he knew he had crossed a line he could never retreat from. He would fight, not just for business or profit, but for the chance to give 2 children a life beyond survival. The courtroom was smaller than Jonathan had expected, almost modest, with beige walls and buzzing fluorescent lights that made the air feel heavier. There were no cameras, no sweeping marble pillars, just the quiet authority of a judge seated at the bench. Jonathan sat at the petitioner's table beside Lena, his attorney, his suit perfectly pressed, yet unable to conceal the tension in his shoulders. Across from him, Troy slouched next to a weary lawyer, his blazer too big, his expression sharp with defiance. For Jonathan, this was not a boardroom or a negotiation. This was something far more fragile. This was about Callie and Noah, and about whether the small flicker of safety they had found would be extinguished. The proceedings began with Troy's attorney painting a picture of Jonathan as a manipulator, a man who had used wealth and influence to lure vulnerable children away from the only home they had known. Jonathan sat still, his hands clenched in his lap, resisting the urge to respond. Lena's hand on his arm reminded him to wait. The words stung, but he held his silence. When it was Lena's turn, she stood with calm precision. She laid out medical reports showing Noah's malnutrition and Callie's untreated asthma. She showed photographs of the apartment, the drawer used as a crib, the cockroaches in the kitchen, the bottles scattered across the floor. She spoke of neighbors who had heard shouting and a store owner who had seen Callie begging for food. Her words built a story of neglect too heavy to ignore. The judge leaned forward when an audio recording was played. Troy's voice filled the room, slurred and threatening, claiming ownership of the child, dismissing Jonathan's care as a passing whim. The courtroom went silent. Jonathan could feel the weight of every eye in the room, but what mattered most was what came next. The judge asked to hear from Callie directly. The door opened, and she walked in holding the gray bunny against her chest. Her sweater was clean, her hair brushed into braids. She climbed into the witness chair, her legs swinging above the floor. The judge spoke gently. "Where do you feel safe, sweetheart? Right now, today, where do you feel safest?" Callie looked down at the bunny, her small fingers gripping tightly, then lifted her gaze toward Jonathan. "With him," she said. Her voice was soft but clear. "With him, always." Jonathan's throat tightened. It was not an argument, not a plea, but the simple truth of a child who knew the difference between survival and safety. The ruling came down that afternoon. Temporary guardianship for 90 days. It was not final, but it was enough. For Jonathan, it was not relief, so much as responsibility. He left the courthouse with Callie's hand wrapped around his fingers and Noah nestled against his chest. The air outside was crisp, the sun faint but present, and for the first time in years, Jonathan felt something real and fragile inside him, a hope worth protecting. The weeks that followed were filled with change. Jonathan signed the lease on a modest apartment near a park, smaller than his penthouse but warmer, cozier. He filled it with furniture that felt lived in, not polished for showrooms. Callie's room had a yellow comforter patterned with clouds, a space just for her. On the first night, she stood in the doorway for a long time before whispering, "It smells clean." Jonathan nodded. It island. Slowly, she began to draw again. Crayon sketches of houses with red doors, stick figures holding hands, a bunny tucked into bed. The refrigerator became a gallery of healing, each paper held up by magnets, shaped like dinosaurs and stars. Noah grew stronger, his cheeks fuller, his laughter filling the apartment with a sound Jonathan realized had been missing from his life all along. There were challenges, too. Some nights Callie cried without words, grief and fear tangled too tightly for her to name. Other nights she asked questions he could not answer, about why her mother had to leave, why people were cruel, whether she would have to go back. Jonathan stayed. He listened. He held her when she trembled, and let silence carry what words could not. And in those moments, trust deepened. It was not a sudden transformation, but a steady weaving of connection, fragile threads forming something stronger. When the final hearing approached, Jonathan felt the weight of it pressing in. Lena prepared him, walking through every possibility, reminding him that courts were not always predictable. Yet when the day arrived, something had shifted. Troy did not appear. His lawyer, disheveled and exhausted, announced that Troy had been arrested on charges unrelated to custody. The judge denied a continuance. Instead, she listened to the representative from Child Services, who described the progress made under Jonathan's care. Callie was attending school regularly, speaking up in class, even telling her teacher, "I have a real bed now." Noah's health had stabilized, his milestones back on track. The representative concluded with steady conviction, "Mr. Miles has provided safety, stability, and nurturing. These children are thriving under his guardianship." The judge sat in silence for a moment, then signed the order. Full permanent guardianship granted to Jonathan Miles. The words hung in the air, heavy and beautiful. Jonathan exhaled slowly, gripping Callie's hand. She squeezed back, her bunny still clutched in her other arm. Outside, the world felt brighter. Callie bounced lightly on her feet. Noah blinked in the robe. Sunlight, and Jonathan felt the corners of his mouth curve into a smile he had not worn in years. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, Callie pulled a folded drawing from her bag. She handed it to him shyly. It was a picture of a house with a red door, a tall man, a little girl, a baby, and above them, a sun shining. At the bottom, written in uneven purple letters, was a single word, "Ours." Jonathan stared at it, his throat thick with emotion. "Can I keep this?" he asked. She nodded. "It's for the wall, like a real family photo." That evening, the drawing was framed and hung in their apartment, replacing a mirror Jonathan had once used to reflect only himself. Now, when they entered their home, they saw not their reflections, but the family they had built together. Later that night, Jonathan tucked Noah into his crib, then knelt beside Callie as she hugged her bunny in bed. She looked at him quietly, then whispered, "Does this mean I get to stay forever?" Jonathan pulled her into a steady embrace. "You will never need to ask for milk again, not as long as I am here." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a promise deeper than any contract or court order. Hours later, when the apartment was silent, Jonathan received a message from an old colleague. It read, "Your story changed how I see things." Jonathan stared at the screen, then at the framed drawing on the wall. He did not reply. He did not need to. The drawing said, "Enough." Sometimes the moments that change us forever arrive quietly, wrapped in the simplest of words. For Jonathan Miles, it was the whisper of a child who wanted nothing more than milk for her baby brother. Those words cracked open a life built on wealth and isolation, revealing something deeper than glass towers and boardroom deals. They revealed the raw truth that what matters most is not what we own, but who we choose to stand beside. Callie and Noah were never meant to cross his path, yet once they did, there was no turning away. In their tired eyes, in their hunger, in their small gestures of survival, Jonathan found a reflection of the boy he once was. But more importantly, he discovered the man he still had the chance to become. With each step sharing a meal, buying a stuffed bunny, standing in a courtroom, promising safety, he rebuilt not only their lives, but his own. Love is rarely grand or perfect. It is found in crayons tucked into little hands, in laughter that echoes for the first time after years of silence, in a child daring to believe that someone will stay. It is in the courage to fight for those who cannot yet fight for themselves, and it is in the quiet promise whispered at bedtime, "You will never need to ask for milk again." This story is not just about Jonathan or Callie or Noah. It is about the truth that each of us has the power to change a life, often when we least expect it. Compassion can break through walls built by fear, and kindness can rewrite a future that once felt hopeless. Sometimes, all it takes is listening to the small voices, the whispers that remind us what truly matters. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that love can be born in the most unexpected places, then we invite you to join us. Subscribe to the Retold Stories and discover more journeys of resilience, healing, and the unshakable power of compassion. Because when we share these stories, we do more than remember them. We live them. And in living them, we change the world, one whisper at a time.